Hello Tolkien geeks. I'm back with another Silmarillion recap video, where I respond to your comments and questions on the Silmarillion Explained playlist. This time we'll be covering Chapter 10 through to Chapter 13. I'd like to first point out that one or two of the comments on this video have also come from early Patreon supporters. And while my responses here aren't an official benefit to patronage, as it would be difficult to commit to structuring these videos in this way, it's great to see some of these same names leaving really insightful or entertaining responses to my videos as well. These people know who they are, and I hope they know how much I appreciate the continued support and encouragement. But let's get stuck into these comments. There are some really interesting themes to think about and revisit in these 4 chapters. Chapter 10 catches us up on everything that has happened in Beleriand, in the northwest of Middle-earth that is, in the years between the departure of the elves back in Chapter 5 and Feanor's rebellion in Chapter 9. In this time, the first battle of Beleriand was fought with Morgoth, resulting in heavy losses for the elves. And most importantly, the realm of Doriath was established by Thingol and Melian, which was the focus of many of the comments on this video. Reflective Rambling had this to share about the Girdle of Melian. I find the protection around Doriath to be fascinating. I can't help but wonder if such protection could have taken other forms, or somehow duplicated, as you pointed out that similar forms show up elsewhere. Much strife could have been saved, I think, if more such barriers existed. Of course, then there wouldn't be as great of a story. Not only was the Girdle similar to the magics that we see the elves employing in the Third Age, as I pointed out in this video, but in the chapter following this one, I went on to highlight the similarity in the language that Tolkien uses when the hiding of Valinor is described, specifically the wording used to describe the shadowy seas and the enchanted isles, which together protected the Bay of Eldamar from approaching vessels. The simplest explanation for what you see here is that this kind of power in the Tolkien legendarium is generally defined by a spirit's connection to a particular location, much like the genius loci of ancient Roman superstition, a spirit of the land. To give this idea a Lord of the Rings context, Galadriel and Elrond have their bases of power in Lothlorien and Rivendell respectively. You could definitely argue the same for Tom Bombadil, Goldberry and Old Man Willow in the Old Forest as well. Even the mountain Caradhras is given an anthropomorphized personality in the text. This is a common Tolkienian trope. So while you might ask, if Melian has this kind of power, why doesn't she use her abilities to set up a barrier closer to Angband itself? Why doesn't she fence Morgoth in, rather than relying on the military strength of the Noldor? The answer is that she can't. Her power is situated where it is because this is where she and Thingol have laid down their roots. And closer to Angband itself is where Morgoth is strongest. It is his base of power. Chapter 11 focuses on the actions of the Valar immediately after the death of the trees and Feanor's rebellion. First, we hear about the hiding of Valinor, which involved fortifying the Calakiria and raising the Pelori Mountains to more extreme heights. The chapter really culminates and climaxes on the creation of the vessels of the Sun and Moon, however, ushering in a new era for Arda, the years of the Sun. Ben Sambo had this to say: "Your take on evil and the Valar was mind-blowing for me. It would have taken me a long time to think that the Valar simply have a hard time even understanding the concept of evil. I thought this was true of the Valar long before now, and I still believe this is a factor, but my thinking on this has changed a little since I wrote this video actually. The reason being, this ties in with something that I read for the first time in the new Tolkien book that was released recently, The Nature of Middle-earth. In the chapter titled Osonwe Kenta, which is an essay on the nature of telepathy in Arda, Tolkien writes, "If we speak last of the folly of Manwë and the weakness and unwariness of the Valar, let us beware how we judge. In the histories, indeed, we may be amazed and grieved to read how, seemingly, Melkor deceived and cozened others, and how Manwë appears at times almost a simpleton compared with him, as if a kind but unwise father were treating a wayward child who would assuredly in time perceive the error of his ways. Whereas we, looking on and knowing the outcome, see now that Melkor knew well the error of his ways, but was fixed in them by hate and pride beyond return. He could read the mind of Manwë, for the door was open, but his own mind was false, and even if the door seemed open, there were doors of iron within, closed forever." There is a lot more of this here, and Tolkien goes on to make a strong argument that a more draconian attitude towards Morgoth by the Valar would have been highly counterproductive, let's say. The stance here seems to be that the Valar could not defeat evil by doing evil. Not a wholly satisfying explanation, I think, at least not by itself, and yet an interesting perspective on Manwë's enormous capacity for pity. And I think I'll just leave that there. The book is still new enough that I wouldn't want to spoil the ending to that essay for anybody that hasn't got that far through the book yet. It's one of the real highlights, actually. I discussed this a little with the book's editor, Carl Hostetter of the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship, for those who may be interested. Chapter 12 is an extremely short chapter, focusing on the awakening of men in the far east of Middle-earth. We won't actually see the men reaching Beleriand until chapter 17, but they get a short summary here, which focuses on the change which has happened in the fundamental nature of Arda itself, with the rising of the sun, and also on the differences between the two races. Chapter 13 sees the return of the Noldor to Beleriand. Feanor, his 7 sons, and his host arrive first, and proceed to wipe out Morgoth's orcs, which had besieged the lands of the Teleri at the end of Chapter 10. My first video on this very long, eventful chapter, which I had split into 2 parts, covers the second battle of Beleriand, the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the death of Feanor at the hands of the Balrogs, Maedhros' capture and rescue by his cousin Fingon, and ends with the first diplomatic exchanges between the Noldor, now ruled by High King Fingolfin, and Thingol, King of the Sindar. SinW88 asks, what are the other clans of elves and dwarves doing during these wars with the Noldor and Morgoth? Well, the Sindar of Beleriand are obviously accounted for in the story as well, which just leaves the other tribes of the Teleri elves. Collectively, these are the Moriquendi, the Elves of Darkness, who never saw the trees of Valinor. Don't let the dark elves of Dungeons and Dragons, for example, influence your perception of the terminology here. These elves aren't evil, with 1 or 2 exceptions, nor are they dark-skinned, and nor do they live underground necessarily, or worship a spider goddess. The Nandor are those elves who did travel westward on the Great Journey, but settled in Middle-earth before ever crossing the Ered Luin and reaching Beleriand. We learnt about some of them already in Chapter 10. We heard how those who entered Beleriand later on were massacred by the orcs and became a reclusive people, living in Osiriand in the forests south of Beleriand. There they became known as the Lyquendi, or the Green Elves. The other Nandor, the ones who never did end up crossing the Blue Mountains, go largely unaccounted for in the Silmarillion, and there are no stories about them in the First Age, but they do form civilizations of their own in the lands east of Beleriand, particularly around the vales of the River Anduin, the same great river which we know well from The Lord of the Rings, of course. These are the ancestors of the Sylvan Elves, who eventually make up the largest part of the populations of the elves of the woodland realms in the Greenwood, Thranduil and Legolas's people, and also the elves of Lothlorien, though both of these groups come to be ruled by Sindar, and in Galadriel's case, Noldor leaders, by the time of the Second and Third Ages. The Avari were the unwilling, those who refused the summons from Aman in Chapter 5 and remained in Cuivienen. We don't know what happened to these elves exactly. In my opinion, most likely the majority of them became absorbed into the Nandor as well, until there simply wasn't any real distinction between the two groups. But your headcanon may vary. We were also told in Chapter 12 that the early men who awoke in the East met and interacted with the Dark Elves, and learned about the existence of the Valar from them, and of the war with Morgoth. Perhaps many of them also continued to have some traffic with the other men who stayed in the East, meaning the Easterlings, who we'll get stories about in later chapters. There are certainly untold stories here. As for the dwarves, there were 7 clans in total, who sprang up at the places where each of the 7 fathers of the dwarves had awoken after Aule had scattered them. The dwarves of Nogrod and Belagost were the Broadbeams and the Firebeards, according to an essay in The Peoples of Middle-earth. It's not clear whether one clan inhabited Nogrod and the other dwelt in Belagost, or whether they were a mixed people, though if I were a betting man, my money would be on the former. I talked about this already in my Chapter 10 coverage, and we'll get more stories about these dwarves in future chapters. Of the other 5 clans, we know only a little bit about what they were up to in the First Age. The dwarves were, of course, a deeply secretive people. Mostly we know about the Longbeards. Those are Durin's folk, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, from whom, of course, the dwarves we know from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are descended. Durin the Deathless, one of the 7 fathers, first awoke in Mount Gundabad, a mountain in the north of the Misty Mountain range, but soon after awakening, he journeyed south and founded Khazad-dûm. The Dwarodelf, later known as Moria, is ancient, and it was mentioned a couple of times already in the Silmarillion. Chapter 10 told us that the elves of Beleriand knew of Khazad-dûm only as a name and a rumour from the words of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. That same essay in The Peoples of Middle-earth tells us that the Iron Fists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks and Stonefoots all dwelt in Rhûn, presumably in the Orocani Mountains there. The Orocani were the Red Mountains, which ran parallel to the Blue Mountains and Misty Mountains, and connected with the Ered Engrin, or Iron Mountains, in the north. But we know nothing about the cultures or histories of these other clans in truth. Hunter Christensen asks, Didn't Tolkien say the world was always round? It's just that men thought it was flat until the downfall of Númenor. Sort of, but that's not exactly right, Hunter. Though it's a great question, and Tolkien did indeed change his mind about this several times. Let me explain. From the start, in the Book of Lost Tales, Tolkien's world was flat, and at this early stage in the development of the Legendarium, the chronology of the mythology ended with Eärendil, and stayed flat throughout. He drew this diagram of a cross-section of the topology and cosmology of Ea as it existed in its original conception. The cosmology of the world continued to evolve from this boat-shaped diagram, but it retained its original flat shape at the beginning of the story, at least, until he was more than halfway through the drafting process to The Lord of the Rings. More on that in a second. The 1977 Silmarillion is based upon several different texts, of course, but the majority of the basis for the text dates from before The Lord of the Rings. Therefore, in the published version of the Silmarillion, the world begins flat and is made round by God after the downfall, just as I've indicated in my videos. If we skip ahead to the end of the Akallabeth, that is, of course, the section of the Silmarillion which follows the stories of the First Age in the Quenta Silmarillion, the narrator explains that after the downfall of Númenor, the greatest mariners of men continued to sail and explore the world, seeking in vain for fallen Númenor, and eventually discovering that if they sailed far enough away from their origin point, they would eventually circumnavigate the planet and arrive right back at where they started. The conclusion is as follows. Thus, in after days, what by the voyages of ships, what by lore and starcraft, the kings of men knew that the world was indeed made round. And yet the Eldar were permitted still to depart, and to come to the ancient West and to Avalone, if they would. Therefore the lore masters of men said that a straight road must still be, for those that were permitted to find it. Tolkien first considered changing the nature of the origins of his cosmology during the drafting of The Lord of the Rings, even writing an alternate version of the Ainulindale in which the sun existed before the beginning of the cosmos. Tolkien tabled this alternative version at that time, and then came back to consider it around a decade later, and we see evidence for this version of events in many of the writings collected in the last 3 books of the History of Middle-earth series, as well as in The Nature of Middle-earth. Changing this element would have had enormous repercussions throughout the entire story, of course. Ea, following the Copernican model of the universe, changes the nature and purpose of the trees of Valinor, which changes the nature and purpose of the Silmarils, and the Silmarils are the central plot thread of the entire Quenta Silmarillion. And so, with this version of the story still very much incomplete, and also perhaps much less satisfying, Christopher chose to leave no trace of this version of the cosmology in the published work. Though it is very interesting to note the trend towards trying to force the Legendarium to be less inconsistent with modern science. My second video on Chapter 13 began with the Feast of Reuniting, and then continues with the journey of the cousins Finrod and Turgon along the river Sirion to the Mares of Twilight, where they received a message and instructions from Ulmo. The chapter continues with the Dagor Aglareb, the glorious battle, in which Morgoth is soundly defeated, the beginning of the siege of Angband, and closes with the first appearance of Glaurung, father of dragons. Vegard Brant Slevigen, and sorry for any mispronunciation there, made an insightful suggestion about the message that Ulmo gives separately to the two princes of the Noldor. Concerning the dream of Ulmo, maybe he fashioned the dream in this obscure way to ensure that the cousins established two separate realms instead of one. I'll guess it would be more plausible that they should unite had one shared his dream and his thoughts with the other. And two hidden cities are better than one? Gondolin is special among the refuges of the Eldar of Beleriand. It lasts longer than any of the other realms, falling last of all, and Ulmo singles it out for his protection, concealing it with his power. Nargothrond also has a role to play in defeating Morgoth, as does Finrod himself, more particularly. But Gondolin is where the saviour of Middle-earth will be born one day, and it becomes clear over the next several chapters that Ulmo and the other Valar, although they may not completely understand the chain of events that will precipitate it, have foreknowledge of the fact that Eärendil will one day seek them out in the west. The point here is that both locations will be important somehow. It is more than a matter of strategy and dividing resources, but one of providence and destiny. But it's telling that, after the initial dream message in this chapter, Ulmo doesn't directly or indirectly intervene in Finrod's story. Finrod has a moment of foresight at the end of chapter 15, but this appears to come from him, from his own prescience, which is in contrast to Turgon, who is revisited by Ulmo at the beginning of the same chapter. Perhaps this indicates that Finrod's presence at the incident at the Mares of Twilight in chapter 13 was just incidental. That's all for now. Thank you for watching. Keep checking back for more updates coming your way soon. Thanks as always to my Axe tier patrons on Patreon: Erin M, Stephen Stark the Mire of Here Be Dragons, Kelly the Jaded Shipwright, and Alexander Petrov.